You're in a parking lot. It's a Saturday afternoon, sometime in the mid-1970s, let's say, and you've just come out of the grocery store. You've got a bag of groceries on the back seat, and in your pocket or your purse, a small plastic canister about the size of a film cartridge. Because that's exactly what it is. You don't bother parking, you just pull around to the far corner of the lot, where a small structure sits island-like in the asphalt. It's tiny. You could almost mistake it for a traffic booth or a guardhouse, but the roof gives it away immediately. Bright yellow, sloped on all four sides, coming to a peak like a little pyramid. You've seen it 100 times. The sign reads, Fotomat. You pull up to the window. An employee, often a young woman, often not much older than the teenagers she went to school with last year, slides the glass open and smiles. You hand over your film cartridge. Window. The whole thing takes about 60 seconds. Tomorrow afternoon, she says, or morning, depending on when the courier comes. You take the ticket, drop it in the glove compartment or your wallet, and pull away. Your groceries are still cold. You never got out of the car. That was Fotomat. If you grew up in the suburbs between the mid-1960s and the early 1980s, you knew that yellow roof the way you knew the golden arches. It was just there, part of the landscape, part of how things worked. At its peak, around 1980, there were more than 4,000 Fotomat kiosks operating across the United States and Canada, primarily in suburban shopping center parking lots, exactly like the one we just described. 4,000 little yellow pyramids, each one staffed by a single employee, each one part of a system that processed millions of rolls of film every year. They are almost entirely gone now. A few survive as coffee kiosks or tobacco stands or watch repair booths, wearing different paint and different signs. Most were demolished when the parking lots were redeveloped, and the ones that remain are invisible to anyone who doesn't already know what they were. This is the story of what they were, how they worked, why they made sense, and why in the space of about a decade they stopped making sense entirely. Let's go back inside that booth for a moment. The interior was small, genuinely small, maybe 8 feet by 8 feet, enough room for a counter, a stool, a cash register, and shelving along the back wall. The shelves were stocked with things you'd expect. Rolls of Kodak film in the familiar yellow boxes, flash cubes, batteries, GE bulbs for flash units, maybe a few Polaroid products. The booth had air conditioning for the summer and heat for the winter. Small mercies in a very small space. What the booth did not have was a bathroom. There was no room for one and no plumbing for one. Employees had an arrangement with whatever store anchored the shopping center, the grocery store, the drugstore, and when nature called, they put up a sign and walked across the parking lot. Nor did it have much in the way of structural protection. Fotomat booths were built low and set on concrete pads in the middle of traffic lanes. People backed into them. People scraped them with fenders. Residents who remember particular Fotomat locations recall, sometimes with a kind of rueful affection, the regularity with which the little structure got clipped by inattentive drivers pulling into and out of the shopping center. The work was solitary in a way that suited some people very well. You were alone most of the day. Between customers you could read, listen to the radio, chat with friends who stopped by. You knew your regulars by name. You knew that Mrs. Kowalski always dropped off film on Friday afternoons, that the family down the road tended to come in every couple of months after they'd finished a vacation role. They called the female employees Fotomates, and the male employees Fotomax Fotomates, and the male employees Fotomax. In the early 1970s, the company's advertising leaned hard into the Fotomate, ads that described the employee as someone who knows quite a bit about film and developing, and who was, the copy cheerfully added, a lot prettier than the corner druggist or the guy at the camera store. Management required Fotomates to wear hot pants, short shorts, modeled on the uniforms worn by flight attendants at Pacific Southwest Airlines. Male employees wore more modest light blue polo shirts. It was a double standard very much of its era, and one that became increasingly hard to defend as the decade wore on. But the underlying transaction, the reason people kept coming back, had nothing to do with any of that. It had to do with convenience. Here's the thing about film in the 1960s and 1970s. Everybody had it, and everybody needed someone else to develop it. You couldn't develop film at home without a darkroom. You couldn't see your pictures until a lab had run the negatives through a chemical developing process and printed them onto photo paper. Before Fotomat, your options were limited. You could mail your film to a processing service and wait a week or more. You could take it to a camera shop or drugstore and wait several days. You could find a local photo lab if you lived near one. What you couldn't do was drive up to a window in a parking lot, hand over your film, and have it back the next day. That's what Fotomat offered. Not speed exactly, Overnight was the promise, not instant, but speed relative to what existed before, and the convenience of the drive-thru, which turned a modest chore into something you did without breaking the rhythm of your day. The claim ticket went in your wallet. A day or two later, sometimes longer if you forgot, you drove back around to the little yellow booth and handed it over. The employee pulled your envelope from the rack, slid it through the window. You'd often open it right there in the car. 24 or 36 prints, depending on how many exposures were in the cartridge. Landscapes, birthday parties, a kid's first steps, the beach in August. Sometimes the pictures came out well, sometimes they were blurry or overexposed or dark. Fotomat had an answer for that too, what they called the Fotomat picture pickup promise. If you weren't satisfied with any print, you could bring it back within a month, and they'd refund it. No matter whose fault it is, the ad said. That was a real guarantee, and people trusted it. The film itself is worth understanding because it shaped everything about how Fotomat worked. In 1963, Kodak introduced the Instamatic camera. The key innovation wasn't the camera itself, it was the film cartridge. Before the Instamatic, loading a camera required threading the film manually onto a take-up spool, a process that was fiddly enough to intimidate casual photographers and lead to wasted exposures. The Instamatic used a drop-in cartridge called 126 film. You opened the camera, dropped in the cartridge, and closed the door. That was it. The cartridge was self-contained. The film and a take-up spool housed together in a plastic casing. No threading, no worrying about light leaks, no finicky alignment. It was photography for people who didn't want to think about cameras. The name Instamatic itself was a blend of instant and automatic, and the marketing leaned into that promise of effortlessness. The result was a revolution. More than 70 million Instamatic cameras were sold in the first decade of production. The number kept growing when Kodak introduced the Pocket Instamatic in 1972, using an even smaller cartridge called 110 film, tiny cameras that could fit in a shirt pocket, aimed at the same mass market but with even greater portability. Photography, which had always required a certain amount of patience and technical know-how, became something ordinary people did without thinking about it. Birthday parties, Christmas mornings, summer vacations. The Kodak moment was already in the American vocabulary by the mid-1960s. The Instamatic made it literal. The film consumption that resulted was staggering. Processors had difficulty keeping up with the volume of Kodak cartridges in the early years, which forced the photo finishing industry to develop new high-volume techniques, splicing together individual film lengths and running them through the same continuous developing process used for motion picture film. And all of those cartridges needed to be developed. This is where Fotomat enters the story. The company was built almost entirely around 126 cartridge film. In the early 1970s, by some accounts, that format represented more than 90% of Fotomat's processing volume. The Instamatic had created the mass market, and Fotomat positioned itself to capture it, not by being a laboratory, but by being the convenient front door to a laboratory. The idea started in Florida. A man named Charles Brown opened the first film drop-off kiosk in 1965. The concept was simple and, in retrospect, obvious. Put a small attended booth in a parking lot where people could hand over their film without getting out of their cars. Brown's kiosk was small and unadorned, no franchise system, no yellow roof, no national ambitions. Preston Fleet saw it differently. Fleet was a wealthy aviation enthusiast and a man whose resume included an improbable range of ventures. His father, Reuben Fleet, had founded Consolidated Aircraft, which became Convair, which built bombers in World War II. Born in Buffalo, New York, Preston, known to friends and associates as Sandy, moved west with his family when the aviation business relocated to San Diego. He had co-founded WD-40, the ubiquitous lubricant, in 1953. He was an aviator, an expert on theater organs, a philanthropist, and, later in life, the author of a book arguing that Shakespeare did not write the works attributed to him. He was, in short, a man who followed his interests wherever they led. On the West Coast, Fleet met Clifford Graham, a La Jolla entrepreneur who was well known in San Diego's social and political circles. Graham was a compact man, 5 feet 4 inches, with a gift for persuasion that bordered on the legendary. Friends described his ability to talk investors into parting with their savings with a kind of awestruck resignation. He carried a pearl-handled revolver. He had opinions about everything. He was a Republican fundraiser with connections that ran from local congressmen to Richard Nixon himself. Fleet and Graham bought Brown's stock shares, arranged for a royalty, and together formalized the operation as Fotomat Corporation in 1967, with Graham as president and Fleet as vice president. The company's early growth was startling. Within 18 months of Fleet and Graham taking control, Fotomat had approximately 1,800 locations. The concept spread quickly because the barriers to entry were genuinely low. A Fotomat booth didn't require a large footprint, just a corner of a parking lot, a lease negotiated with the shopping center, and a deal with a regional photo processing lab. The booth itself was a prefabricated structure. You could put one up and have it operational in days. The yellow roof was the franchise's most important asset. Fleet and Graham understood that recognition and visibility were everything for a business that relied on impulse convenience. You had to be able to see the yellow pyramid from the road as you were turning into the parking lot. You had to register it immediately, the way you registered McDonald's Golden Arches. One industry observer later described Fotomat as the McDonald's of photography, and the comparison was deliberate. The idea was the same: consistent visual identity, repeated across thousands of locations, built into the geographic memory of the suburbs. The design worked almost too well. In 1970, Fotomat redesigned its kiosks to make the distinction clearer, a settlement that cost the company some of its visual simplicity but ended the legal dispute. That same year, the company went public. The timing tells you something about the confidence behind the operation. 7 years later, in 1977, Fotomat was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. At one point, Fleet and Graham each held stock valued at approximately $60 million. But Graham was already gone by then. He'd been pushed out of the company in 1971 amid allegations that he was using company funds for personal political interests. He was a supporter of Richard Nixon and had brought in NFL veterans as franchisees through his connection to Jack Kemp, the football player and future congressman who served briefly as an assistant to Fotomat's president. Graham's post-Fotomat career was, to put it charitably, colorful. He used the fortune he'd accumulated to purchase a 180-foot yacht, a fleet of luxury cars, and a mansion in Rancho Santa Fe that had once belonged to Bing Crosby. And then he launched a company called Ore Magnetics. Ore Magnetics claimed to have discovered a revolutionary magnetic separation process that could extract gold and other precious metals from raw ore. Graham told investors he could, in essence, turn sand into gold. He dropped names freely: congressmen, business leaders, the kinds of prominent San Diegans whose involvement lent the venture a veneer of legitimacy. Money poured in. Estimates eventually ranged as high as $10 to $13 million. The gold never materialized. When investors began demanding results and threatening legal action, Graham didn't litigate. He didn't negotiate. He packed his car, locked his 2 Doberman pinschers behind the gates of the Rancho Santa Fe mansion, and vanished. A federal grand jury indicted him in 1986 on 22 counts of mail fraud, wire fraud, income tax evasion, and filing false tax returns. The FBI classified him as a fugitive. He was never found. Associates speculated that he had either successfully eluded authorities or been killed by an investor unhappy with losing money. The FBI eventually closed the case. Graham, if alive, would be nearing 100 years old. Fleet himself took a different path. He sold off his Fotomat shares by the mid-1970s and turned his attention to the world of immersive cinema. In 1972, he conceived the idea of projecting motion pictures onto a giant tilted dome screen, the system that would become known as OmniMax. He funded and built the world's first OmniMax theater as part of the Reuben H. Fleet Space Theater and Space Museum in San Diego, named for his father. The Canadian company IMAX manufactured the projectors based on Fleet's concept, and the technology was eventually installed in more than 100 theaters worldwide. Fleet died of cancer on January 31, 1995, at the age of 60. His obituaries mentioned Fotomat, OmniMax, WD-40, and his book about Shakespeare. The company he had co-founded was, by then, a fraction of what it had been. But let's go back to the peak, back to the years when the system was humming. By 1980, Fotomat reported annual revenue of $236.7 million. The kiosk count stood at over 4,000 in any suburban shopping center parking lot from California to Connecticut. From Minnesota to Florida, you could find the yellow roof. The company was, by any reasonable measure, a success story. To understand why Fotomat worked and why its particular model was vulnerable, you need to understand the supply chain behind that claim ticket. The booth was not a laboratory. Let's be clear about that. The Fotomat employee did not develop your film. She received it, logged it, and handed it to a courier. The courier picked up film from multiple kiosks on a regular route, once or twice a day, and transported it to a regional Fotomat processing lab. The labs were not glamorous places. They were industrial-scale operations, long rooms filled with processing machinery, tanks of photographic chemicals, and technicians who spent their days running film through developing lines. The process itself was adapted from the same continuous developing technique that had been devised to handle the massive volume of Instamatic film. The individual cartridges or rolls from different customers were spliced together into a long, continuous strip. That strip ran through a series of chemical baths. Developer, which converted the light-sensitive silver salts on the film into visible silver, the image, then stop bath to halt the development, then fixer to make the image permanent, then a water wash, then drying. The whole chemical sequence was timed precisely. Too long in the developer, and the image went dark. Too little, and it stayed pale. From the developed negative strip, an automatic printer projected each frame onto photographic paper. The paper ran through its own chemical sequence: developer, stop bath, fixer, wash, dry, and emerged as the prints you'd eventually see in your envelope. The finished prints were cut, matched to the original order by the identifying numbers on the negatives, slipped into an envelope with the negatives, and loaded onto a return courier run. Your film dropped off Monday morning would be back at your local Fotomat by Tuesday morning. This is what overnight meant. Not an hour, not 2 hours. One day, and in the context of what had existed before, week-long mail processing, multi-day wait times at the drugstore, one day felt nearly miraculous. The economics of the system were well engineered, at least initially. The kiosk itself required almost no capital, no kitchen equipment, no inventory of perishables, no specialized furniture, shelving for film products, a cash register, a counter. The building was prefabricated and small. The real cost was the processing infrastructure, the regional labs, the courier network, the photographic chemistry, but those costs were spread across enormous volume. Fotomat's labs were processing film from hundreds or thousands of kiosks simultaneously. The per-roll cost of processing dropped as volume rose, and volume kept rising. The franchise model accelerated growth without requiring Fotomat corporate to fund every new location. A franchisee paid for the right to operate a kiosk, took on the lease and the local operating costs, and sent their film to the corporate-owned labs for processing. The corporate entity collected the processing revenue. It was a system designed to scale, and it did scale, from about 24 locations in the San Diego area in 1967 to 1,800 in 18 months, to approximately 2,500 by 1975 to over 4,000 by 1980. The company was adding roughly 500 new kiosks per year during its peak expansion phase. The labor market that fed the kiosks was exactly the kind of labor market the model required. An enormous pool of young, part-time workers willing to sit alone in a small booth for an hourly wage. The work was not skilled in the conventional sense. You didn't need to know anything about photographic chemistry to hand a film cartridge to a courier and give change from a register. You needed to be personable and reliable. That was more or less it. The skilled work happened elsewhere, in the labs, where trained technicians understood color correction, timing, the subtle art of getting a good print from an average negative. Those technicians were a smaller workforce, more specialized, more experienced, more difficult to replace, but customers never saw them. What customers saw was the yellow roof and a smiling Fotomat. The complexity behind the claim ticket was entirely invisible. There was one other thing the system depended on, and it's worth naming clearly because it becomes important later. Film never stayed in one place. Your cartridge left the Fotomat kiosk in a courier bag. It traveled to a regional lab. It was processed alongside hundreds of other customers' film. The finished prints traveled back on a return run. At no point in that chain was your film in a secure, immovable location. It was in transit. Bags got mixed up. Occasionally a roll was lost, an entire vacation, a child's birthday, a wedding reception, simply not in the envelope when you got home and opened it. This happened rarely. Fotomat's system was generally reliable, but it happened. And for a customer whose roll of irreplaceable photographs disappeared somewhere between the kiosk and the lab, no amount of process reliability made the loss acceptable. It was a fragility at the heart of the model. And when the time came for customers to choose between a system where their film traveled across town on a courier route and a system where it never left the counter in front of them, that fragility would matter. By the mid-1970s, Fotomat had become one of those businesses so embedded in daily American life that most people stopped noticing it. That's the highest form of commercial success, not admiration, but invisibility. Was just infrastructure. It was just infrastructure. It was just how things worked. You didn't go to Fotomat because you'd thought about it. You went because you'd finished a roll, and that's what you did with a finished roll. The routine was built into the rhythm of family life in the suburbs with such thoroughness that it required no decision. You dropped it off. You came back. You got your pictures. The scale of this is worth sitting with for a moment. 4,000 kiosks, at a minimum, each processing dozens of rolls per day. Multiply that across a week, a month, a year. You're talking about hundreds of millions of photographs moving through this system annually. Birthday parties and beach vacations and little league games and first days of school and Christmas mornings and everything else that families thought worth documenting. All of it on film. All of it needing a lab, a word about what it was like to get those pictures back. You picked up your envelope, and you didn't wait until you got home. You opened it in the car. You rifled through the prints right there in the parking lot, engines still running. The pictures arrived as a kind of rediscovery. Even though you'd taken them yourself, you couldn't always remember exactly what was on the roll. You might have shot the first half at a 4th of July barbecue, and finished it 3 months later at a Halloween party. The two events came back together in the same envelope, summer and fall, in the same stack of prints. Some pictures surprised you, some disappointed you. The one where you were sure you'd gotten the perfect shot of your daughter blowing out her birthday candles, blurred. The candid at the picnic you hadn't thought much about, perfect. That was film. You worked with what you got. The negatives came back in a strip, cut and sleeved. Careful people kept them in albums alongside the prints. Less careful people put them in a shoebox. Either way, they accumulated. A family's history in envelopes, organized by date, each one starting with the Fotomat claim ticket still tucked inside. And outside the car, the parking lot went on doing what parking lots do. People pulling in, pulling out, loading groceries, returning carts. The ordinary Saturday machinery of suburban life, happening all around you while you sat in the driver's seat looking at a photograph of your mother holding a baby who is now in college. That collision, the mundane and the precious in the same moment, in the same parking lot, and was built into the Fotomat experience. It wasn't designed, it just happened. And it happened to millions of people, thousands of times a day, for the better part of 2 decades. In December 1979, Fotomat attempted something that, in retrospect, is one of the more fascinating footnotes in American retail history. The company launched a VHS movie rental service. They called it Fotomat Drive-Thru Movies. The logic was straightforward. Fotomat had more than 3,000 locations, each one already positioned as a drive-thru convenience stop. Americans were buying VCRs. The technology had arrived, and the demand for home video content was real and growing. Fotomat had the infrastructure. Why not use it? Customers received a catalog. They called a toll-free number, selected the titles they wanted, and picked up the cassettes at their local Fotomat kiosk the following day. The initial selection featured Paramount Pictures titles: The Godfather, Grease, Saturday Night Fever, Airplane. The cassettes came in a distinctive format: black die-cut cardboard cases with black labels and white titling, minimal artwork, branded with the Fotomat logo. A 4-tone Fotomat sound signature played before the start of each movie, accompanied by an artistic rendering of the yellow pyramid roof. It was one of the first corporate audio logos in the home video business. Walt Disney Home Entertainment joined the service in March 1980. MCA followed. Warner Brothers, Columbia Pictures, and EMI came aboard as well. The initial rental price was $12 per title for 5 days. In today's money, that's somewhere around $50. The price was later reduced to $9.95. It was, briefly, a genuinely significant operation. Fotomat was one of the first companies in America to offer nationwide VHS rentals. This was years before Blockbuster existed, years before the video store became its own neighborhood institution. In the earliest years of home video, before rental shops existed on every corner, Fotomat's network represented one of the only ways an ordinary consumer outside a major city could get their hands on a rented movie. By 1982, it was over. Local video stores had begun offering the same titles for less money, available the same day, without the overnight wait. The advantage that had made Fotomat's film developing model work, next-day pickup as the fastest option available, didn't translate to a world where the product was a physical cassette rather than a developed roll. A cassette didn't need to be processed. Same-day rental was perfectly achievable. And once local stores offered it at competitive prices, Fotomat's drive-thru network wasn't a convenience advantage. It was just a middleman. The VHS experiment tells you something important about how Fotomat's leadership understood their situation in 1979. They knew the company's primary business was vulnerable. They were trying to find new uses for the infrastructure they'd built. The fact that they moved fast and thought creatively says something in their favor. The fact that the same dynamic that would eventually kill their film business killed their video business first, a more convenient, faster, cheaper alternative appearing almost immediately, was not a coincidence. Through all of this, Fotomat remained profitable enough to matter. The company reported $236.7 million in annual revenue as late as 1983. It held an 18% share of the American photo processing market at its peak, 18%, in an industry processing hundreds of millions of rolls of film per year. And then, very quickly, it didn't. To understand what killed Fotomat, you need to understand one machine. The story of that machine begins in Wakayama, Japan, in the workshop of a man named Kenichi Nishimoto. Nishimoto had founded a company called Noritsu in 1951, starting with an automatic print paper washer, a modest product aimed at making the tedious wet work of photo, finishing a little easier. Over the next 2 decades, Nishimoto and his engineers kept working on the problem of photographic processing, driven by a simple question: could you shrink the equipment enough to put the entire developing and printing sequence inside a single, self-contained machine? In 1976, Noritsu introduced the QSS-1, the Quick Service System. It was the world's first mini-lab, and the name tells you most of what you need to know. It was a small, self-contained film, processing and printing system. 3 years later came the QSS-2, which incorporated a microprocessor and could take film from development through color printing in 45 minutes. The mini-lab arrived in the American commercial market in earnest in the early 1980s. Noritsu established its American subsidiary in 1978, and as the machines improved and became more affordable, they began appearing in pharmacies, supermarkets, and camera stores across the country. The machines were not cheap. Installing one cost a store somewhere between $50,000 and $100,000, but that cost was within reach for pharmacies and supermarkets, which had something Fotomat didn't. They were already in the business of getting people through the door. If a Walgreens or a Kroger installed a mini-lab and offered 1-hour photo processing, customers might come in specifically for the photos and stay to buy aspirin or bread or whatever else they needed. The photo lab became a reason to visit. In retail, that's called a loss leader. You price one service competitively, even at minimal profit, because it brings in foot traffic that spends money elsewhere. And the profit margins on individual prints were extraordinary. A camera store owner in the late 1980s could make a print in a mini lab for roughly 3 or 4 cents in materials cost and sell it for 36 cents. Every customer who brought in a roll of film bought 24 or 36 prints. Whether or not more than 2 pictures on the roll turned out well. At those margins, a mini lab was viable at 25 to 30 rolls a day, solidly profitable above 50, and a gold mine above 100. For a standalone kiosk in a parking lot with nothing else to sell, there was no equivalent strategy available. Fotomat was only ever in the photo business. There was nothing else to offer. Here's the math that changed everything. When Fotomat was at its peak, overnight film processing was the fastest option a consumer had. You dropped off your film Monday, you picked it up Tuesday. That was the speed of the market, and Fotomat had built its entire infrastructure around it. The mini-lab changed the speed of the market to 1 hour, not next day, not by Tuesday morning. By the time you finished your grocery shopping, you dropped off your roll at the pharmacy counter. An employee fed it into the mini-lab, which ran it through a condensed chemical processing sequence, developer, bleach fix, stabilizer, dryer, and printed it automatically. By the time an hour had passed, your prints were in an envelope on the counter. You were still in the store. And because the film never left the store, no courier, no transit, no regional lab, there was no possibility of it getting lost. Your negatives were right there, 10 feet from where you'd handed them over. Early mini-labs could produce several hundred prints per hour. The machines kept improving through the 1980s, faster, more automated, producing better color correction than previous generations. By the mid-1980s, a well-run mini-lab in a busy pharmacy could handle significant volume without a specialist technician running the machine full-time. The early 1-hour labs charged more than Fotomat. For a while, there was a meaningful price premium. Early entrants into the 1-hour market were charging roughly twice what overnight competitors charged. Some customers stayed with Fotomat on price alone, but the price premium didn't hold as mini-labs proliferated. 600 locations in 1980, then 14,700 by 1988. Competition among the labs themselves forced prices down. By the late 1980s, you could get your film processed in an hour at a price that was competitive with what Fotomat had been charging for overnight service. Overnight, at a price roughly equal to 1 hour. The choice wasn't difficult. Watch what happened to Fotomat's numbers during this period. In 1980, Fotomat held approximately 18% of the American photo processing market. That was the high watermark. By 1988, 8 years later, its market share had fallen to 2%. From 18% to 2% in 8 years. The mini-lab count tells the other side of that story. 600 locations in 1980, 14,700 by 1988. The mini-labs had captured roughly a third of the entire $4.5 billion American photo finishing market by that point. One number exploded, the other collapsed. They were the same story told twice. The company saw it coming. As early as 1981, Fotomat's own president, Richard D. Irwin, was telling the New York Times that the biggest single factor in the company's struggles was, in his estimation, Fotomat's own mismanagement, specifically the overextension. The kiosks opened too close to one another, cannibalizing the sales of their neighbors. In 1983, the company announced plans to close 1,000 locations. 1,000 in a single announcement. That's not a strategic adjustment. That's a company acknowledging that a quarter of its footprint should not exist. What's worth pausing on here is the structural reason Fotomat couldn't simply replicate what the mini-labs were doing. The company's business model was built around the drive-through kiosk, the courier, and the regional processing lab. Those three elements worked together as a system. If you wanted to offer 1-hour processing, you needed to put the processing machinery inside the kiosk, but a Fotomat kiosk was 8 feet by 8 feet with no plumbing and no room for industrial equipment. You couldn't fit a mini lab in a Fotomat booth. You could theoretically build larger kiosks or convert to a different kind of retail footprint. Some companies tried, but Fotomat's network of 4,000 small parking lot structures represented an enormous sunk cost. The leases, the prefabricated buildings, the courier contracts, all of it was built around a model that required 1 day, not 1 hour. And even if Fotomat could have installed mini labs, it would have been competing with drugstores and supermarkets that had a fundamental advantage. They sold other things. A Walgreens with a 1-hour photo counter could absorb thin photo margins because customers also bought toothpaste and greeting cards and cold medicine. A Fotomat kiosk had nothing else to fall back on. The Minilab didn't just offer a faster service, it invalidated the architecture Fotomat had spent 20 years building. That's a different kind of competitive threat. It's not a company offering the same thing cheaper. It's a technology that makes the infrastructure itself obsolete. There's a parallel worth noting. Fotomat had gone through something similar with its VHS rental service in 1982. A technology arrived, local competitors offered the same service faster and cheaper, and Fotomat's drive-through next-day model couldn't compete. They'd seen the pattern once already. The difference was that VHS rentals were a sideline, an experiment. Film developing was the entire business. A business doesn't usually disappear overnight. It drains away. There's a moment, sometimes a clear one, sometimes diffuse, when a business stops being a growing thing and becomes a shrinking one. For Fotomat, that moment was somewhere in the early 1980s, when the Minilab count crossed a threshold and the company's market share began its decade-long collapse. After that, the story is one of steady contraction, failed adaptation, and the gradual closing of locations that had once seemed permanent. The 1,000 closures announced in 1983 were the first wave. By 1986, the company had been sold, purchased by Konishiroku Photo Industry, the Japanese firm better known as Konica. For a company that had been listed on the New York Stock Exchange less than a decade earlier, the sale to a foreign industrial buyer represented a fundamental change in what Fotomat was. It was no longer an independent American growth story. It was a subsidiary, managed for whatever value could be extracted from the remaining network. By 1988, all of the Chicago and Milwaukee area kiosks had closed. That detail appears in the historical record almost as a footnote, but it's significant. Chicago and Milwaukee aren't small markets. They're major American cities, with the suburban geography, the shopping centers, the parking lots that Fotomat had been designed for. When those markets went dark, it meant the model had stopped working, not at the margins, but at the core. Rochester, New York, Kodak's own company town, had once been home to 33 Fotomat locations. The kiosks there sold Kodak film, used Kodak paper and chemicals for processing, and were, in a sense, part of the local ecosystem of photographic commerce. They too disappeared. By 1990, the total number of operating Fotomat locations had fallen to approximately 800, down from 4,000 at the peak. In 10 years, 3/4 of the network had disappeared. What was it like to work in a Fotomat booth during the decline? The historical record doesn't give us a single compelling portrait, but the shape of the experience isn't hard to reconstruct. Fewer customers, longer stretches of quiet between transactions, the awareness that the drugstore 200 yards away now had a 1-hour photo counter, and that your regulars, the ones you knew by name, the ones who came every month or two with a finished roll, were going there instead. Some stayed loyal, some came back out of habit or familiarity, or because they'd always gone to Fotomat and hadn't thought to change. But the foot traffic was thinning. You could feel it in the daily rhythms of the booth. The workers who were displaced when a location closed were mostly young, mostly part-time. The loss of a Fotomat job was not, for most of them, a career catastrophe in the way it might have been for a 20-year factory worker or a senior technician. It was a job that ended. You found another one. The loss was more significant for the skilled workers in the labs, the technicians who understood photographic chemistry, who could look at a print and diagnose an exposure problem or a color shift. That knowledge had value when there was an industry to employ it. As the processing volume collapsed through the mid-1980s and into the 1990s, the number of jobs requiring that knowledge collapsed with it. It wasn't the kind of skill that transferred easily to other industries. It was specific, and the thing it was specific to was going away. And there's an irony in the Minilab transition that rarely gets mentioned. The Minilab brought the processing inside the store, but in doing so, it also lowered the bar for who could operate the equipment. The early Minilabs still benefited from skilled operators who understood the chemistry and could diagnose color shifts and exposure issues. But as the machines became more automated through the 1980s and 1990s, that human expertise became less necessary. The machine did the color correction. The machine timed the chemical baths. A retail employee with a few hours of training could run a Minilab well enough for consumer-grade prints. The craft knowledge that Fotomat's lab technicians had spent years acquiring was being rendered redundant, not just by a different business model, but by the machines themselves. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, The company tried to find its footing. They had already tried VHS rental. They offered to transfer your old Super 8 home movies to videotape, a genuine service, and one that found a small market among families who wanted to retire their film projectors. They sold blank videotapes. They looked for anything that could run through the drive-through window. Fotomat also made film strips for schools. Teachers could bring in 35mm single-frame film and a cassette tape with a soundtrack, and Fotomat's lab would produce a custom-captioned film strip for classroom use. It was a niche service, and it served a real need in the era before PowerPoint and projectors, but it was never going to sustain a national network. None of it was enough to sustain 4,000 locations or even 800. The photo business, the core business, the entire reason for the yellow roof, had shifted away from them structurally, and no amount of product diversification through a kiosk window was going to replace it. Konica sold the remaining Fotomat assets to Viewpoint Corporation in 2002. By then, there were only a handful of kiosks still operating under the name. The brand had become a ghost of itself. Viewpoint converted the Fotomat identity to an online digital imaging service, Fotomat.com, where users could upload and store their photos in the early years of the digital photography transition. It was an attempt to keep the name alive in a fundamentally new medium. It lasted until September 1st, 2009, when the website ceased operations. The last thing Fotomat offered, in its final iteration, was a place to store photographs you'd taken on a device that didn't use film at all, the complete inversion of what it had been built to do. The digital camera had arrived in earnest through the late 1990s and early 2000s, but as a cause of Fotomat's disappearance, it was almost beside the point. By the time affordable digital cameras reached mass-market consumers, Fotomat had already fallen from 4,000 locations to a handful. The minilab had done the structural damage. Digital finished what remained. What digital did was complete the logic that the minilab had started. The minilab eliminated the weight. Digital eliminated the film. The minilab made the courier obsolete. Digital made the lab obsolete. Each step removed another layer of the infrastructure that Fotomat's business model depended on. And the minilab industry itself would eventually face the same reckoning. The machines that had destroyed Fotomat were themselves destroyed by the digital transition. Noritsu, which had held 50% of the global minilab market, saw its core business collapse in the 2000s as digital cameras made film processing unnecessary. By 2006, Konica Minolta, the same company that had bought Fotomat, withdrew from all camera and photo businesses entirely. Kodak, which had introduced its own American-made minilab in 1987, filed for bankruptcy in 2012. The entire ecosystem, film, labs, minilabs, processing chemicals, photographic paper, contracted to a fraction of its former size. The minilab killed Fotomat, digital killed the minilab, and the phone killed most of what digital had built. Each wave was faster than the last. By 2009, the year Fotomat.com went dark. The consumer photography market had been rebuilt from the ground up. Most photographs were taken on phones or digital cameras, stored on hard drives or SD cards, shared instantly online. The idea of driving to a parking lot and handing a cartridge through a window and coming back the next day, it had become something that required explanation. What happened to the yellow roofs? Many were demolished when shopping centers were redeveloped. A Fotomat booth in the corner of a parking lot was not an asset anyone felt obliged to preserve. When the lease ended and the location closed, the structure was often removed, sometimes quickly, sometimes left to sit and fade. But concrete lasts, and the little huts were sturdily built. Enough of them survived to attract a new generation of entrepreneurs who recognized what they'd overlooked. A prefabricated drive-through structure in a parking lot with low overhead was still a useful thing, just not for film. Some became coffee kiosks, some became tobacco stands, others watch repair booths, locksmith huts, windshield wiper dealers, tailors. In at least one case, a former Fotomat was converted into a crochet museum. In a few places, the yellow pyramid was repainted, but the shape remained, serving a completely different function to customers who had no idea what the shape had originally meant. There's a website, Fotomatfans.com, that maintains an interactive map of surviving Fotomat structures. As of 2025, the count is a fraction of what it once was. Hundreds of structures across the US and Canada, mostly altered, some abandoned, a few still recognizable. People photograph them the way they photograph other vernacular roadside architecture. Grain elevators, drive-in theater screens, neon signs from motels that closed in 1978. Artifacts of a world that organized itself differently. There's a woman, the story has been told a few times in a few different ways, who had lunch at a strip mall restaurant. In the parking lot outside sat an old Fotomat booth, badly vandalized. She mentioned it to the bartender. The bartender shrugged. "Used to be a security shack," she said. She had no idea idea what it actually was. There was no reason she would. That's where we are with Fotomat now. The people who remember it clearly. The yellow roof, the claim ticket, the envelope rifled through in the parking lot, the surprise of finding a picture you'd half forgotten you'd taken. For them, the booth was a fixture of their daily lives for years, maybe decades. For anyone who came of age after the early 1990s, it's nothing. It's a shape in a parking lot, if it's still there at all. That gap between vivid memory and complete absence is exactly the gap that makes this story worth telling. So let's be honest about what was lost and what wasn't. What Fotomat offered that genuinely no longer exists in quite the same form was a particular relationship with time and memory. Film photography had a built-in delay. You took pictures and then you waited. The roll might take weeks to finish. You started it at Thanksgiving and completed it at Christmas. When you finally dropped it off and came back the next day, the pictures arrived as a kind of archaeology. You opened the envelope and remembered things you'd half forgotten. That delay was not a flaw in the system. It was a feature, though nobody called it that. It created a separation between the moment of taking the photograph and the moment of receiving it, a gap that let the event become the past before you saw its documentation. The prints arrived as objects. You held them in your hands. You wrote on the back of some of them. You put them in a shoebox or an album. The claim ticket in your wallet. The expectation that built over a day or two. The ritual of picking up and opening. All of it was part of a relationship with your own memories that digital photography, for all its genuine advantages, replaced with something faster but structurally different. That's not a complaint. It's just an observation. The thing that replaced it, instant review on a phone screen, thousands of images stored in the cloud, the ability to reshoot immediately if the first frame didn't work, is objectively more capable. You can take more photographs, see them immediately, store them indefinitely, share them in seconds. The tools are, by every functional measure, superior. What changed is something harder to measure. The weight of the printed photograph, the specificity of the object you held, the fact that you had chosen, by the act of shooting a finite roll, which moments were worth the frame. A roll of 126 film gave you 12 or 20 exposures. A roll of 110 gave you 12 or 24. Each frame had a cost, the price of the film, the price of the developing. That scarcity was a constraint, but it was also a kind of discipline. You composed the shot, or at least you paused before pressing the shutter because the click meant something. It was irreversible. It used one of your finite frames. The gains were real, let's name them plainly. 1 hour photo processing was genuinely more convenient than overnight. It was also eventually cheaper. Competition among minilabs through the late 1980s drove processing prices down, not up. Customers who switched to the drugstore minilab weren't sacrificing quality for speed. The minilabs, as they matured, produced prints that were comparable in quality to what Fotomat's labs had been delivering. And digital, of course, made the economics of photography essentially free at the consumer level. No film to buy, no processing fees, no limit on the number of shots you could take. Photography went from a considered activity with real costs attached to something people do reflexively, dozens of times a day, on devices they already carry everywhere. That democratization is real and it matters. The Instamatic had made photography accessible to ordinary families. Digital made it universal. Photography as an activity is now available to everyone in a way that even the most optimistic camera company executive of 1970 couldn't have imagined. And there's a further irony worth noting. The Instamatic's simplicity, the drop-in cartridge, the automated exposure, anticipated exactly the trajectory that digital would complete. Kodak's project to develop the Instamatic began in the early 1950s under the working title Easy Load, later updated to Project 13. The goal was always to eliminate every possible barrier between the user and the photograph. The Instamatic removed the complexity of loading film. Digital removed the film itself. The Instamatic name became so embedded in the culture that when Instagram launched in 2010, its filters and square format aesthetic were explicitly designed to evoke the look of Instamatic-era snapshots. The simple, geometric physical camera design directly inspired the app's logo and visual language. The grandfather of the smartphone photo was the plastic Kodak Instamatic, and the infrastructure that the Instamatic built, the mass market of amateur photography, the vast network of processing labs, the Fotomat booth in the parking lot, was dismantled by the very logic the Instamatic had set in motion. Make it simpler, make it faster, remove the next barrier. What Fotomat's story fits into is a pattern that ran through the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st. The overnight model destroyed by the 1 hour model. The 1 hour model destroyed by the instant model. The specialized storefront replaced by the loss leader counter in the supermarket, which was replaced by the software on the phone. Each wave of convenience made the previous wave look slow and inconvenient. Each wave eliminated a layer of intermediaries that had existed to manage a physical constraint. When the constraint disappeared, so did the intermediaries. Fotomat was an intermediary between the consumer and a processing technology they couldn't access at home. When that technology moved inside the stores where they already shopped, and then inside the devices they already carried, there was no longer anything for Fotomat to mediate. The drive-through model the company pioneered didn't die with it, though. Look around any suburban commercial strip and you'll find it everywhere. Coffee kiosks, pharmacy windows, bank drive-thrus. The idea of staying in your car and receiving a service was sound. It just migrated to categories where the service couldn't be miniaturized and brought inside a store on a counter, and in a number of cases, literally, physically, it migrated into the Fotomat huts themselves. The concrete footings are still there, the shape is still there, the yellow has been painted over. But the idea of the drive-through kiosk in the parking lot corner, built for one employee and a transaction that takes less than a minute, that survived, wearing different colors, serving a different product, to customers who've never heard of film. The last image worth holding onto is a simple one, the claim ticket. Every time you dropped off a roll, you got a small paper ticket. It had a number on it, and the date your pictures would be ready, and the name of the location. You put it in your wallet or your pocket or the glove compartment. You forgot about it for a day, or 2 days, or sometimes longer, and then you remembered and you drove back and you handed it over, and your pictures were there, waiting. That was the promise. Not speed, not magic, just a quiet certainty that the thing you'd handed over in trust would be returned to you, intact. There's something in that worth remembering. The patience of the transaction, the faith of the claim ticket. A lot of people still have shoeboxes full of those old prints. Some of the envelopes still have the claim tickets tucked inside because nobody ever thought to throw them away. Yellow paper, black ink, a name, a date, a number that corresponded to a roll of film that no longer exists. The pictures exist though, faded a little maybe, corners bent, but there. Here's the thing about businesses like Fotomat. They don't disappear because they failed. They disappear because they succeeded, completely, at exactly the right moment, for exactly as long as the conditions allowed. Fotomat solved a real problem. It solved it elegantly. 4,000 yellow roofs in 4,000 parking lots, each one part of a system that returned your memories to you in an envelope by the next morning. The conditions changed. They always do. The minilab arrived, and the math shifted, and the logic that had made Fotomat indispensable made it obsolete almost overnight. Not because the service got worse, because the world it was built for quietly became a different world. That's the story of a lot of things we've lost. Not lost to failure, but lost to replacement. Lost to something faster, something cheaper, something that fit better inside the life people were already living. You can understand completely why it happened and still find something worth noticing in what went away. The photographs are still out there, millions of them, in shoeboxes and albums and the backs of closets. Pictures taken on Instamatic cameras, developed in Fotomat labs, picked up at little yellow booths in shopping center parking lots across America. The booth is gone, the lab is gone, the courier is gone, the claim ticket has long since been thrown away. But the picture of your grandmother at the kitchen table on Christmas morning, 1974, that one's still around. And somewhere in the chemical layers of that print is the faint trace of a system that existed to bring it back to you. A courier, a lab, a young woman behind a window who smiled and said, "Tomorrow morning." That was enough. For a while, that was exactly enough. If you grew up with Fotomat, if there was a yellow booth in the parking lot of your shopping center, if you remember dropping off film and coming back the next day, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. Do you remember which shopping center it was in? Do you still have prints from those years? A few of you might even know what became of your local booth, whether it's still standing, and what it's selling now. And if this is new to you, if you've been learning about Fotomat for the first time, we hope it feels a little less strange now. The yellow roof, the claim ticket, the envelope in the parking lot, a system built around a very particular moment in how people lived, how they captured things, how long they were willing to wait for their memories to come back to them. It made sense, completely, until it didn't.